and we talked about this being a relationship and trust business first and foremost, right? Like real estate is sort of an ancillary benefit to what we do. But if you have the relationship, I'm not one of these people who's scared of tech. I think AI is great. I think, the technology, the platforms that we have, those are all great. Those are accelerators. They don't replace the trust. They don't replace the relationships that we have.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Why Do I Suck as a Real Estate Agent podcast. I'm your host, Monte Reyment. Today, I have Bobby Mathews, a broker and associate office manager at Remax Foxfire in Ocala, Florida, where he and his leads agents development and brokerage growth across multiple offices with over 25 years of real estate experience. He began his career in new home sales and at Dell Webb and on top of the world, building a strong foundation in construction and community development. Bobby, welcome to the episode, man.
Thank you, Monty. Glad to be here, man. Excited about it.
All right, man. So I love it. I know we were just talking off camera, and Bobby and I made a real agreement that this is going to be a really short podcast because he's a Bears fan, I'm a Packers fan, but I digress from there. But anyway, so tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got started. I always like, hearing the origin story. 25 years is a long time, so you have a few tips and tricks up your sleeve, I'm sure. But where did it all start? Where did that love for real estate come in?
Always had it, Monty. Always had it. So I was in financial services when I was in Chicago, sold the brokerage before moving down here and, played golf for about 6 months and was trying to kind of figure out what to do with my life. And, always had that interest in real estate. Got a great opportunity with Dell Webb to start selling new homes for them. And, it just hit. It was everything I expected it to be. No 2 days are exactly the same. That's what I love about it. Yeah. You get to meet all kinds of people from all different spectrums and backgrounds. So that variety itself is the spice for me for what I do. And I just enjoyed the relationship building aspect of it. Yeah. And, almost 25 years into it, man, I'll tell you, I don't get Monday morning blues. I love going to work. I love the people I work with. It's just really exciting. There's that 2% that we won't talk about, but 98% of my customers and agents, just beautiful. Love it.
Yeah, exactly. And a little bit about, when we have the essence of this podcast, that's the reason for it, is relationship building. The why do I suck, connotation kind of has a negative tone to it, but when we actually lay it out, it really is kind of like the reason I started is because I had somebody come to me and say, why do I suck at this? It wasn't because she didn't want to be good. It's just she was having the wrong behaviors and things like that. And so that's the essence of the podcast. But I mean, you have 25 years of experience in here. A playbook for growing a brokerage, acquiring agents, offices, can be painfully slow at certain points. And then developing those agents is even tougher. How do you practically test the agent when they get started to make sure, one, they're a cultural fit, but two, that they have what it takes to get over the mental hurdles of this business?
Gotcha. Well, the culture fit, that has to come first for me, because the wrong person, you can always add people, but adding numbers doesn't quite relate the story if it's not a right fit by culture. So if these folks aren't, treating their customers right, if they're not treating their agents around them correctly, if they're not a team player, they're not willing to step up and help when somebody else needs it, then, it's a different conversation. But if it's a good fit culturally, we always, one of my favorite sayings is, hey, you bring the will, I'll teach you the skill. If you don't have the will, it's a different story. Because a lot of people come from 9 to 5s, Monty, and they're used to having somebody else dictate, what sort of tasks are done during the day. When you get into general real estate specifically, you're sort of an entrepreneur for yourself and you're becoming a CEO. And our job is to kind of teach you how to become a CEO of your own business and run it when nobody's looking. So the culture comes first, everything else comes second for us. And that's the way we wanted to grow. Is and if you ask me how we got there, it's because we've made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
Where we saw production numbers that were great. We said, hey, listen, we're just looking at, we just look at the bottom line and say, hey, this person can bring X amount to the dollar, to the company dollar, and we make that higher, and it just wasn't the right fit culturally, and it does a lot more damage over the long term. So we've learned our lessons. If the person's the right fit as a person, as a professional, everything else we can figure out. We've got a great coaching system in place. When people come in, not just the contracts and how do we differentiate between a standard contract and NASs. All that stuff is just low level stuff. It's the high level stuff that we really worry about. What are your ethics? What are your concepts on how you build relationships? How do you maintain those relationships, and how you fit in with the rest of the company?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really good. So when you're looking for a new agent, let's say an agent, is maybe 2 or 3 years into the business, they've struggled at another brokerage, they think the grass is greener. What are you looking for in that agent when they come over?
I'm just looking for, one, production's not as important to me because sometimes that's a consequence of the environment that they're in. So I try not to hold production against them, but I want to know, what are your goals? What are the most important things in real estate for you? And if that answer is not, relationships, taking care of the customers, doing the right thing 100% of the time, then, that's a different conversation for us. But if all those things fit in properly, then we say, hey, listen, let's sit down and let's take a look at the next 6 weeks. And we've got a process that's already set up. Remax is really good at that. We've got systems already set up where we can plug and play and say, hey, here's what we need you to do as far as your lead generation is concerned. Here's what we need you to do as far as marketing is concerned. And here's where you develop your sales skills and your contract skills. Make sure that you're doing all the right things. Negotiations become a big part of it. But the thing that I harp on very consistently, and this is not just with newer agents, but also with agents who've been with us for a very long period of time, is the communication aspect of it. Back in the pandemic days, you're basically a transaction agent. You're just trying to kind of put everything together and get the deal done. But the ones that are really successful in markets like this that are normalizing are the ones that value relationships, know how to communicate, and stay upfront. A lot of the times, we tell our agents, if a customer's called you because of something, you've lost the impetus. You want to be the person making that call. You want to be upfront. You want to be the one calling the seller and saying, hey, it's 2 weeks. We haven't had a showing. Here's what we need to do in order to get the home sold. So we want agents who are proactive, that don't run and hide when there's bad news. Those are all things that show character to me. So those are the things that are most important when we're hiring somebody. We, certainly do the one-on-one hiring and the agent add-ons one by one, but our strategy has shifted a little bit. We're more into acquiring teams and, gaining market share that way, which brings its own challenges, Monte, because when you're talking to one person, there's a set level of variables that you're dealing with. But when you're talking about teams, those variables expand exponentially. So now you've got so many more personalities to deal with. So, what we take a look at is one, what's the culture of that team looking like? What's the leadership of that team looking like? And, and the production comes third. And that's the way we really want to build the business.
Yep. I love it. So, you mentioned a couple of great things in there. I think the one thing, we were talking about pandemic, and the pandemic was almost too easy, right? Like it was hard if you were a buyer's agent, extremely difficult, because there are times where you're going to 20, 30, 40 showings, writing 10, 15 offers and not getting them. And then, you talked about the market normalizing. So you're in the business 25 years. You've probably seen three or four, cycles now at this point. You had the 08, 09 kind of thing is probably about when you started, right? And then
I started out in 2003 in real estate. So I've seen 3 market cycles.
Yeah. So what, now you had mentioned a normalized market, which I started in 2019, which I thought was a normal market. And then pandemic came and it was like, I barely have my feet wet yet. So 2018 is when I started, I guess. And then 2019, I finally got my feet wet. And 2020 was like, okay, time to go. And, you either sink or swim at that point. It was easy to be a real estate agent at that point at, rates in the 2s and 3s. So, now that the market slowed down a little bit, anxiety spikes for some of these agents. Last year, I think it was 70% of agents in the country didn't even transact. What should an agent actually watch to regain their confidence, ignore the noise at this point? And you and I would call it a normal market.
Yeah. So it is definitely a normalizing market. The headlines don't always tell the story on what's happening in real estate, especially because, real estate tends to be so hyper local. I mean, being in the market that you are, Monty, you see that more than anybody else. What's happening in Green Bay is not what's happening in Milwaukee. What's happening in Ocala here is not what's happening in Tampa or Miami. So everybody has a little bit of a different experience. So what I tell our agents to focus in on is, let's look at Marion County specifically. What's the inventory looking like? What's the absorption rate? What's the velocity of sales? Days on market. So those things carry a lot more weight for me looking at just our specific MLS numbers than the headlines do. It's nice to track what's happening nationally. We draw a lot of our customer base from the Northeast part of the country, right? So New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts. So it's important to know what's happening there. But it's more important to know what's happening here. So when somebody gets here, how are you guiding them through the process? Are you telling them in certain neighborhoods that it's still a seller's market as opposed to being a buyer's market when you take a look at a county-wide perspective on it? So having that hyper local knowledge is very important for our agents and for our customers, and that relates through when somebody comes in and you sit down with them and you say, hey, in this particular community, the inventory is still very much limited. We're seeing that homes are selling for 98, 97% of their list value in X amount of days. That sort of information is very important for a buyer, especially in these days where, affordability has become a big issue right now. Rates have become a big issue. So we want to make sure that, they're making the right decision for themselves and their families, and they know how they're positioned before they walk into the market.
Right, exactly. So, all right, sweet. So, you talked to there's so many things there, but you're talking about educating your agents, educating your buyers into surviving this market. But then, how much does niche play a role with your area? I mean, you guys have a lot of 55 and older living in that area as well. So how does that? I mean, I'm assuming you have young people living there too. But how much is a niche for an agent? How important is that for an agent to eventually find their niche?
I think it's huge. I think when anybody starts out in real estate, you start out doing everything, and you should, because, you really are not in a position to be picky about things when you're starting out. You want to catch every transaction you possibly can, but eventually the goal is to become an expert in something. If you tell somebody that you're an expert in everything, really what they're hearing is that you're an expert in nothing, right?
Yeah.
So niches
The jack of all trades,
important.
master of none, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, you brought up, and you're absolutely right about that. We have a huge segment of 55 and over active adult communities in the area. You have Stone Creek on top of the world, Ocala Preserve, and of course the 800-pound gorilla, the Villages. So we've got a huge offering just for that 55 and over community, because that's what we've seen as a trend of customers coming in. But what's also behind the scenes is that Chewy.com built a huge distribution center here in Ocala. Amazon did, FedEx did, Dollar General did. So that's bringing in a lot of jobs that are not in that 55 and over demographic. So the housing demand is yet to catch up to all the jobs that are coming in. And so you're seeing a lot of new builders putting up homes that are not just for 55 and over communities, but also multifamily condo developments, things like that. So we've got a great balance in it. And of course, Ocala being the horse capital of the world, there's a huge equestrian market here also.
Yeah.
World Equestrian Center just, built that's a huge facility that's built in, that's revolved around the equestrian lifestyle and the luxury lifestyle that comes with it. Golden Ocala has, huge luxury estates in the equestrian field. And then we've got, all sorts of different equestrian offerings too. Everything from, 100-acre farms to 5-acre mini farms. So knowing how to navigate those markets is going to be very important. I'll just take one example for it. If you're looking at On Top of the World, or you're looking at Stone Creek, which is right next door, which is Del Webb's community, and you're very particular about how you cook your food, and you only want to use natural gas, it eliminates Stone Creek as an option, because On Top of the World has natural gas piped in. Stone Creek does not. If you're looking at the equestrian lifestyle, you want to make sure that, the area that you're buying in has good drainage in the pastures. So you don't want to be in a low-lying area. Knowing those little things
Mm-hmm.
make a huge difference down the line. Knowing how to deal with somebody who's buying a hobby farm as opposed to a professional operation when it comes to, the equestrian aspect of things, that's a huge difference. And the more you know, the better you can guide your customers. You want them to be able to think of your name first when they're thinking about a specific thing, whether it be a 55 and over neighborhood, whether it be multifamily or first time home buyer. You want your name to be the first thing they think about when they're thinking about these things. And that's where expertise and being in a niche really make a difference.
Yeah. So at what point do you have that conversation with an agent? It'd be like,
About
hey, I
having
think
a,
it's time. I think it's time for
yeah,
you to find your niche at this point.
right when they get to that $3 to $5 million a year range, when they're doing
Okay.
that much in volume, we say, hey, now let's start focusing on what you find yourself being most comfortable in. What are the conversations that you feel that you're having naturally because either you have an aptitude for it, you've dealt with it enough where you can talk about it, professionally and efficiently. And then, it's like back engineering it based on the agent's sort of aptitude towards a specific thing. So if they like working with 55 and over active adult communities, let's focus in on that. If you like working with, first time home buyers, let's work on that. But it's also a multifaceted sort of approach, right? We don't want agents just to be buyers agents, just to be listing agents. You can certainly start out that way, but we want a more balanced approach. And I find that, agents who have both buying side and selling sides tend to, survive market conditions better than somebody
Yeah.
who's just focusing on one side.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I think that's a great point. The word you kept saying is like, do you like doing this and you like doing that? Because your job is going to be a lot easier if you like working with equestrian or you like working with 55 and older, you like working with first time home buyers. Personally, my favorite is still working with first time home buyers because it's such an impact, on those, people getting their home for the first time. And it's the biggest, probably the biggest accomplishment for most people is there's a lot that goes into being a first time home buyer. And for you to be sitting at closing table with those people, it's always, to me, it's the most rewarding transaction.
Absolutely, Monty. I've seen that so many times myself, and I completely agree with you. Having a first-time home buyer sitting there, getting their keys at the closing table is a huge thing. One that comes pretty close to that is people who are buying their first retirement home.
Yeah.
Where
Yep.
you've built up all these hopes and goals of what your retirement life is going to look like, and when they're finally here and they understand that, hey, this is the next
Mm-hmm.
chapter of my life where the horizon's wide open, whether you want to do, adult education or golf more or play pickleball, that sort of resort living and being at the cusp of that comes pretty close to being that first time home buyer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think too, long-term strategy, right? On a first-time home buyer, that person is probably going to transact a couple more times in their life. So if you want that longevity, every about 5 to 7 years, somebody moves, so on average. So that's it's always a good thing.
Absolutely. You're going to get a big kick out of this. We've been in Ocala since 1973, yeah. So we've been here for a very long period of time, the brokerage has. So we have agents who've been with us for 25, 30 years. And you come across stories where these agents, first sold a home to a buyer and seller or a buyer, and now, their kids and their grandkids are buying from the same agent. That kind of generational sort of trust that's what warms our hearts. That's the whole goal of it is, helping families through generations and all of them trusting us to get it done for them. That's really
Well,
cool for me.
yeah, that was a really great segue. I had a question in there with the legacy and trust. And I think as the industry shifts now towards more digital transactions, we have a ton of AI and AEO and SEO, and we've talked about that a couple of times on this show. But I still feel like the relationship, the local trust is still going to outperform any marketing tech company. We've seen that in our area where Redfin's trying to come in and they get a little traction and they're gone, and then You'll see them pop up every now and then. They'll get something that falls in their lap, but then they're gone. And so I think why, I mean, we know why, but like for people out there listening and for agents that are here that are trying to improve, why is local trust much more important than just having the shiny tech, in their pocket?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Monty. I mean, when we talked about this being a relationship and trust business first and foremost, right? Real estate is sort of an ancillary benefit to what we do. But if you have the relationship, and I'm not one of these people who's scared of tech. I think AI is great. I think, the technology, the platforms that we have, those are all great. Those are accelerators. They don't replace the trust. They don't replace the relationships that we have. And when people are making the most important decision for them, for most of their, for most people, the most important decision financially is buying a home. It's difficult to trust somebody who is offsite that has, an iBuyer platform where everything is based on algorithms. It's important to have somebody who knows the neighborhoods, knows the school districts, knows the communities, knows what's around, especially, let's just narrow it down to 55 and over neighborhood. Medical facilities are very important. Golf cart accessibility becomes very important as some people try to, start to lose the ability to drive independently. So, expanding the offerings to have somebody gain that independence becomes very important. Having somebody on, that's hyper focused on local knowledge and understanding what's available within the community itself it's never going to get replaced.
In regards to Bobby, his company, Remax Foxfire, celebrating their 50th year in business in 2026, marking a major milestone in Central Florida. The brokerage is also expanding its presence to the villages and surrounding areas while supporting the Humane Society of Marion County as their 2026 charity, including summer charity barbecue and ongoing. So you guys can reach Bobby. Just look for him on the Remax profile, his Facebook at Remax Foxfire, Instagram, Foxfire Realty Florida, and then LinkedIn, Remax Foxfire. If you want to reach out to Bobby, his phone number is 352-281-5650. What a great episode. There are so many great nuggets there. I want to thank Bobby for coming on. And I'm your host, Monte Reyment. That's the Why Do I Suck as a Real Estate Agent podcast. We'll see you guys again soon. What a great episode. What a great guy, despite him being a Bears fan and all. And we'll see you guys next time. Stay tuned. So that's a wrap here on the Why Do I Suck as a Real Estate Agent podcast. Thank you so much for spending time with me and our guests. The people you hear on the show really aren't guessing. They've been doing the work. They've been doing it for a long time. They're sharing their behaviors, their habits, their successes, their systems that actually lead to real work, real success. So please subscribe and follow so you don't miss the next conversation. Until next time, remember, you don't suck. You're learning. It's the beginning, or maybe you're in a rut, but you don't suck. So make a few changes, stay curious, stay consistent, and please keep coming back.